You are listening to the Intentionally International Congregation podcast. We are the Reverend Matthew Laferty, the Reverend Anitra, and the Reverend David Smith, three Americans living in Europe and involved with English-speaking congregations in non-English-speaking countries. We think that there's something interesting going on in these congregations, and we want to share what we learn with you. Today, Matthew and I are talking to the Reverend Daniel Morrow.
My name's Dan Morrow. I'm an Episcopal priest. I'm at the Church of the Ascension in Munich, the Episcopal parish in Munich. I've been here since November. Also have served churches in Zurich, Switzerland, and Paris, France, as well as several places in the U.S. And I'm happy to be here and talk to you guys today.
We're grateful for Dan's time today because together we're going to be talking about an international congregation in the middle of big change, hard change.
I think the congregation's in the midst of kind of a healing process right now. They had the last rector had to be removed by the bishop, anytime you have that kind of process, there's kind of factioning in a church, and there was.
And we wanted to see what Dan is thinking about as he enters this call to Ascension. It turns out that he's thinking about a number of things, and that he thinks in systems, in processes, and in stages. I think this helps to diagnose a congregation's health and then to prescribe, well, perhaps the better word is to discern God's guidance for this congregation into a healthy and world-changing future. We also wanted to find out what he thought about doing this work in an international congregation.
I'm interested in your work in intercultural congregational development and the thesis you've been working on. I'm not sure the status of that, if it's still in process or if you finished that, but tell us more about what that looks like and what you've been thinking about.
So I'm still writing the thesis, and it's about intercultural congregational development, and it's based on the work of Milton Bennett, who's one of the forebears of intercultural theory, and he developed what's called the intercultural development continuum. And it's a developmental continuum, and the theory says that every person goes through the various stages, but you can stop at any one of the stages. You can never, it's a developmental arc. And the thesis is basically an intercultural competency at its most basic level is how one approaches to and responds to difference. How one approaches difference, how one responds to it, how one acknowledges it, how one either accepts or rejects, or just misses it entirely. So the thesis is basically, if you can develop the intercultural competence of your leadership, then you will also have a leadership that is more nimble, more adept at addressing change, better able to address conflict. So it's equating intercultural competency with facility and change processes, facility and working through conflict. The idea is that some of the skills and the mindset that you develop as you develop your intercultural competency are also the same skills and mindset you need to address complicated change or complicated issues and problems. So the idea is that it's the difference between that technical change and adaptive change, And basically adaptive change requires, in essence, and it requires the same skills that intercultural competency requires. So the thesis is if you build your competency interculturally, you also will have kind of concomitant competencies that are built up that will serve the church.
Great, thank you. One of the things that we're interested in hearing is both frameworks, the theoretical, but also how this lives out in congregations of different sizes, shapes, denominational affiliations, places, all kinds of things. Help us understand what your congregation looks like. You've mentioned already it's 50% British, 20-ish% North American, US, Canada, and the other 30% from other places. What other kinds of diversity is present there that needs to be tended to, or maybe is marginalized, or minimized is the word that you were using, that is minimized in some of the conversations in the congregation?
Yeah. So part of what I'm going to say is kind of conjecture. I don't know, and I'm not judging at all. I do know that the church was in the past much more diverse than it is now. And much of the diversity in the church from majority world countries, from Africa and from Asia, etc. Much of that left the church in the early mid 2000s when the Episcopal Church ordained an openly gay bishop. And from what I heard, it wasn't really discussed, talked about. It was just accepted and said, if this is who we are, these are our values. So and it's values that I resonate with very strongly. The thing I wonder about is because a large group left the church and have never come back. And we usually kind of chalk that up to, well, some people are liberal and some people are conservative. And that's true. So don't want to minimize that. At the same time, though, there are processes that acknowledge diversity, that give people opportunities to express their thoughts, feelings, and also feel a part of the church, that when used can help to hold communities together in spite of significant differences in theology or in politics. When you're the only game in town, in a sense, we're really the only kind of very liturgical English-speaking church in the area. You're naturally going to have more diversity than you would in a place like the States, where people can self-select based on affinity or political ideology, etc. You can't really self-select here in that same way. So if it's really about how one reacts to differences and the skills that one develops to address those differences, it's one of the most important skills I think clergy and church leadership can develop. For instance, if anyone who's been in a church longer than a minute has been involved in some kind of conflict, and many times those conflicts, especially in international churches, are just laden with cultural baggage that either goes unacknowledged or is or unassumed even, or even worse, and what gets more vitriolic is when behaviors that mean one thing in one culture are assumed to mean something quite different in another culture. So for instance, in Germany, let's just Germany and US. In Germany, people are much more direct than even the United States, which is one of the more direct cultures in the world. But people will say, but they will say things here that come from a place of caring and concern that are more direct than people from the US are used to hearing. And they're more direct than people from England, which is even less direct than the US are used to hearing. And they're way less direct than some African or South American cultures or Caribbean cultures, where you would say, for instance, in Zurich, every time my boss said, "Oh, that's interesting," I knew that he hated the idea, because he was English, and he was much less, he didn't want to hurt my feelings. So he said, "Oh, well, that's interesting. We'll have to think about it," which meant, please never bring that up again. Whereas a German might say, "I think that's a terrible idea, and here are the reasons why it's bad." They're not being rude. They're being German. They're being direct. They're offering their perspective to you as a gift. And if you interpret it as rude, then you've really kind of missed the intercultural highway.
You talked about Ascension having an extended period of conflict, some of the worst kind of conflict that you can get into in a church, with the loss of a pastor, as well as the cultural wars, this is what I would call it in the United States, but I think just the overall issues around what is and is not within the boundaries of appropriate or not appropriate sexual orientations or behaviors. You're saying that Ascension has kind of gone through a lot of uncomfortable space, and a conflict that was made even worse by unexamined cultural contexts between the people within the congregation. And now you are here 90 days in. Where now what?
We are, we're in the middle of a process where we're working with the congregation to, in very approachable ways, to talk about identity and values, so that we can, because many times conflicts and not just conflicts, but ineffectualness just is a result of conflicting commitments. So it's not just competing or conflicting assumptions. So this is what a church should do, and somebody's acting and always in a meeting, always pushing for this agenda while other people are pushing for this agenda. So we're working on identity and values through some kind of very approachable processes, so that what we can do is we can say, this is who we are. This is what we value about our Anglican identity, the stream that we come from, not denigrating any other streams, but saying but really living into that. Because as you mentioned, a lot of times, even though you might have a Methodist church or a Lutheran church internationally, the majority of people may not be Methodist or may not be Lutheran.
No, you were talking. I think this is we've taken an interesting route to get to this point, but it's this question about identity, and you're talking about identity and values and cultivating a stronger or clearer Anglican identity as part of your vision for your ministry and for the life of this congregation that you're serving.
If you know who you are and you can express that clearly, if you know what your values are and you can express them clearly, if you know, then moving on, you can say, okay, this is what we're called to do. And even something as simple as this is what we feel called to do in the next couple of years, right? You can get as granular as you like. Then what you can do is you can say no more effectively and more compassionately. And your no is not, can be seen as it's seen as a statement of identity and not a statement of preference, or not a statement of who's in the in crowd and who's out.
And how are you planning to cultivate some of that identity? I think particularly, how are you planning or thinking you could cultivate a stronger Episcopal Anglican identity within this community?
So part of how we're cultivating this sense of identity is through a series on identity and values. And it's a Wednesday night series on Zoom. So last week I taught about specific facets of Anglican spirituality. It was received pretty well, I think. We didn't have a ton of people come, so we need to maybe offer it again or find different avenues for offering it.
As you can tell, Matthew and Anitra talked to Dan early in his process. How does it work out? Can good border keeping of denominational identity help an international congregation recover and thrive? We hope to talk to Dan again in a few months to find out.
I am the Reverend Anitra Kitts, and together with the Reverend Matthew Laferty and the Reverend David Smith, we produce this podcast, Intentionally International.